The first thing I remember was the sound of her screaming my name from inside a burning house. The second was her father standing in the street, watching the flames swallow the upstairs windows, and shouting at me, "Stay away from my daughter," as if I were the danger. And the third was the moment I carried her through the smoke, placed her trembling body into her father's arms, and realized she was gripping my shirt so tightly that she refused to let me go. Before we begin, if you believe in kindness, forgiveness, and second chances, please like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe for more heartfelt stories. Your support helps us bring more inspiring stories to life. My name is Caleb Mercer, and before that afternoon, I believed that saving someone meant the story ended the moment they were safe. I learned the hard way that sometimes saving a life is only the beginning of the hardest part. It was a warm Saturday in late spring when everything happened. I was driving home from a small repair job on the east side of town, my hands still smelling faintly of engine oil, when I noticed smoke rising above the trees. At first I thought someone was burning leaves, but then I saw black clouds rolling over the roof of a two-story house. A woman was standing in the middle of the street screaming for help, and neighbors were running toward the property. I pulled over before I even realized I had made the decision. Someone shouted that the fire department was on its way. Someone else yelled that there might still be a person inside. Then I heard a voice from an upstairs window. A young woman was pounding against the glass, coughing desperately. She was trapped. I remember the heat hitting my face as I approached the house. Every reasonable part of me screamed to wait for the firefighters, but the woman at the window was disappearing behind thick smoke. I could see her trying to open the window, but something was blocking it from inside. I ran toward the front door and found it already unlocked. Smoke poured out so heavily that I had to crouch almost to the floor. I pulled my shirt over my mouth and moved through the hallway, following the sound of her coughing. The staircase was hot beneath my hand, and pieces of burning material were falling from the ceiling. I almost turned back when I heard a crash upstairs, followed by her voice calling, "Please." I climbed. Her bedroom door was partially blocked by a fallen bookcase. I pushed against it once, twice, and finally hard enough to move it aside. She was on the floor near the window, one hand pressed against her shoulder and the other reaching toward me. Her face was streaked with tears and soot. She looked terrified, but when she saw me, something changed in her eyes. "I thought nobody was coming," she whispered. I told her that I was there now and that she needed to trust me. She tried to stand but collapsed immediately. Without thinking, I lifted her into my arms. She felt frighteningly light. The smoke was getting thicker, and my lungs burned with every breath. I wrapped one arm around her and held her head against my chest as I carried her toward the stairs. Halfway down, the ceiling above us cracked. The sound was so violent that she screamed and buried her face against me. I moved faster. A burning beam crashed behind us, blocking the hallway we had just crossed. There was only one direction left. Down. I stumbled on the final steps, fell hard onto one knee, but somehow kept my grip on her. When we reached the front door, a firefighter rushed toward us and helped pull her free. I followed a second later, coughing and barely able to stand. She was lying on the grass when a paramedic began checking her breathing. Then a man came running through the crowd. He was older, perhaps in his late 50s, with silver hair, a dress shirt, and an expression of pure terror. He pushed past everyone and dropped beside the young woman. "Elena," he cried. "Elena, look at me." She opened her eyes, saw him, and then immediately looked over his shoulder toward me. Before the paramedic could stop her, she reached for me. Her fingers caught the sleeve of my burned jacket. I took one step closer, but the older man suddenly stood and blocked me. "Stay away from my daughter." I thought I had misheard him. I looked at Elena, then at him. "Sir, I know what you did," he snapped. And I said stay away. The firefighter standing nearby gave him a strange look, but the man didn't move. Elena tried to sit up and immediately winced from the pain in her shoulder. "Dad," she said weakly, "he saved me." Her father stared at me with something far deeper than anger in his eyes. It looked almost like fear. That was the moment I realized there was something about me he knew that I didn't. Her name was Elena Vale. I learned that later, because her father refused to tell me anything. The ambulance took her away, and the firefighters stayed behind to contain the fire. I watched the smoke disappear into the afternoon sky before getting into my truck. I was exhausted, my clothes were torn, and a small burn on my forearm was beginning to sting badly. But none of that bothered me as much as the expression on Elena's face when they carried her away. She hadn't looked at me like a stranger. She had looked at me like someone she desperately needed not to lose. For the next few days, I tried to forget about her. I went back to work. I replaced a customer's broken water heater, repaired an old truck, and spent an afternoon helping my neighbor fix a fence. But every time my phone rang, I wondered if it was the hospital. I never gave anyone my number, so I told myself it was impossible. Then, 3 days after the fire, I found a folded piece of paper beneath the windshield wiper of my truck. There was only one sentence written on it. "I need to know why my father is afraid of you." I knew immediately who had written it. Elena. We met at a quiet coffee shop the next afternoon. She arrived wearing a simple blue sweater, her left arm still in a sling. The burns on her face were minor, but there was a small bandage near her temple. She looked different from the frightened woman I'd carried out of the fire, yet there was something familiar in her eyes. She thanked me first. Then she asked the question that had been haunting me. "Have you ever met my father?" I told her no. "Has he ever seen you before?" Again, no. She looked down at her coffee and slowly said, "Then I don't understand why he looked at you like he had been waiting years to see you." Neither did I. Elena told me her father, Graham Vale, had always been protective. He owned a successful construction company and had raised her alone after her mother died when Elena was 6. Their relationship had never been simple. Graham loved her fiercely, but he controlled nearly every part of her life. Where she worked, who she dated, where she lived. She had recently moved into the house that burned down because she wanted independence. Then she said something that made my stomach tighten. "My father told me you were dangerous." I laughed quietly, not because it was funny, but because I didn't know what else to do. "I walked into a burning house to get you out." "I know. So why would he say that?" Elena stared at me for several seconds. "That's what I'm trying to find out." Over the following weeks, we became friends. At first, it was because neither of us could understand what had happened. Then it became something neither of us wanted to name. I helped her find a temporary apartment while her house was being rebuilt. She insisted on paying me for the time I spent helping, but I refused. We started having lunch together. She made fun of the way I drank coffee black. I teased her because she always carried 3 pens even though she only used 1. Little things became important. I discovered that Elena wanted to become a children's art therapist. She believed that children sometimes expressed pain through pictures long before they could explain it with words. She showed me a sketchbook filled with drawings from her college years. One drawing caught my attention. It was a picture of a little girl standing beside a hospital bed, holding the hand of an older man. "That's my mother," Elena said. I asked about her. Elena became quiet. "My father told me she died from complications after surgery." Something about the sentence felt unfinished. One afternoon, while helping Elena sort through the belongings recovered from the fire, we found a metal box beneath a damaged dresser. Inside were old photographs, letters, and a newspaper clipping. Elena unfolded the clipping and froze. It was an article from 23 years earlier about a fatal apartment fire. The photograph showed a young woman standing beside a firefighter. The firefighter was my father. My hands went cold. Elena looked at me, then at the article. The woman's name was Marianne Vale. Her mother. I had never met Marianne. My father had died when I was 13, and I knew almost nothing about his work beyond the fact that he had been a firefighter. But the article said he had been one of the first responders at a fire that killed a woman named Marianne Vale. It also mentioned that he had rescued a 6-year-old girl from the building. Elena. I looked at her in disbelief. You were the little girl? She nodded slowly. My father said the firefighter who saved me made a mistake that killed my mother. The room seemed to shrink around us. Then she pulled another letter from the box. It was written by my father. The letter had never been sent. In it, he explained that Marianne's death had not been caused by his actions. He had discovered evidence that the fire had been deliberately set. He believed someone had tampered with the building's electrical system. He had reported his concerns, but the investigation had been closed because a powerful contractor connected to the building had pressured witnesses. That contractor was Graham Vale. Elena covered her mouth. Her father had been the man my father suspected. But the truth went even deeper. My father had discovered that Marianne had been planning to leave Graham. She had found financial records showing that Graham's company was hiding dangerous construction violations. She intended to expose him. The fire had erased the evidence, and my father had spent years trying to prove what happened. Elena began crying. My father told me your family destroyed ours. I shook my head. He blamed my father for your mother's death. No, she whispered. He blamed him for knowing the truth. That was the moment everything changed. Graham hadn't told Elena the truth because he wanted her to believe my family was responsible. He had spent 23 years protecting himself behind a story built from grief. And then came the most painful revelation. Elena's mother had survived the initial fire long enough to reach a window. My father had tried to save her. But another section of the building collapsed before he could reach her. He had carried Elena out instead. He had saved Elena. And Graham had spent his entire life hating the man who had done it. I thought the truth would bring us together. Instead, it nearly destroyed us. When Graham discovered that Elena had found the letters, he came to my apartment. He looked exhausted, older than he had on the day of the fire. He didn't threaten me. He simply said, "You don't understand what it was like to lose her." I told him that I did understand loss. He looked at me and whispered, "No. You don't." Then he admitted something I never expected. He had caused the original fire. Not because he wanted Marianne dead, he claimed, but because he wanted to destroy the documents she had collected. He said he had left a faulty electrical device running, believing the fire would be small enough to contain. It wasn't. Marianne died. Elena nearly died. My father spent years carrying the guilt of failing to save Marianne, while Graham carried the secret. I wanted to tell Elena, Graham said, tears filling his eyes. But every year that passed made the truth harder to speak. I could have hated him. Part of me did. But then I remembered Elena. I remembered how she looked at me when she thought nobody was coming. I remembered how she had held my shirt as if letting go meant disappearing again. I told Graham that he needed to confess everything. He did. The investigation reopened. Graham accepted responsibility for the fire and for years of deception. He lost his company, his reputation, and much of the wealth he had spent his life protecting. But Elena didn't lose her father. That was her choice. For months, she struggled with anger. Sometimes she couldn't speak to him. Sometimes she sat in her car outside the courthouse and cried because she didn't know whether loving her father made her a bad daughter. I never told her what to feel. I simply stayed. Not as a rescuer. Not as someone trying to replace what she had lost. Just as Caleb, the man who happened to walk into a fire and discovered that some people spend their entire lives trapped inside another kind of flame. One afternoon, almost a year after the fire, Elena and I stood outside the rebuilt house. The walls were new, but she had kept one thing from the old place, a small metal box containing her mother's letters and my father's unsent confession. She looked at me and said, "You know what I was most afraid of after the fire?" I shook my head. That if I let go of you, everyone I loved would disappear again. I took her hand. "You don't have to hold on because you're afraid," I told her. "Hold on because you choose to." She smiled through tears. Then she pulled me close. Her father watched us from the porch. He walked toward us slowly. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Graham looked at me and said, "I spent 23 years blaming the wrong man." I told him that sometimes grief makes people build walls around themselves. He nodded. "I know. But walls don't protect you forever. Sometimes they just keep the people who love you outside." He reached out his hand. I shook it. It wasn't forgiveness all at once. It wasn't the kind of perfect forgiveness that makes everything disappear. It was smaller and more real than that. It was a beginning. Later that afternoon, Elena and I sat beneath the oak tree in her yard. She rested her head against my shoulder, and for the first time, the silence between us didn't feel heavy. It felt peaceful. The fire had taken her house. It had taken her mother decades earlier. It had taken my father years of peace because he carried a guilt that never belonged to him. And it had nearly taken Elena's relationship with the only parent she had left. But it hadn't taken everything. Because kindness had survived. Love had survived. And somehow, after all the lies, all the anger, all the loss, we had discovered that second chances don't erase the past. They simply give us the courage to stop letting the past decide what happens next. Speech balloon special request: before the story ends, tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were in this situation? If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe for more meaningful and inspiring stories. Your support encourages us to keep creating stories that touch hearts around the world. Years later, Elena told me that the day of the fire was the worst day of her life and the beginning of the best chapter she had ever known. I used to think that sounded impossible. How could the worst moment become the beginning of something beautiful? Now I understand. Sometimes life doesn't save us by preventing the fire. Sometimes it saves us by sending someone brave enough to walk through the flames with us. And sometimes the person we think is coming to rescue us is actually there to remind us that we were never meant to face the darkness alone. Love isn't about forgetting what happened. Forgiveness isn't about pretending nothing was broken. And second chances aren't about returning to the life we had before. They are about choosing, despite everything, to build something better from what remains. Because when everything burns away, the things that survive, kindness, courage, love, and hope, are often the things that matter most. If you want, I can continue the story exploring the relationship between Caleb and Elena. Summarize key takeaways from the story about forgiveness and second chances. Explain the story's major characters and their motivations in plain language.